Snow fell like scattered ash, settling on a roof of the lonely depot where smoke from the departing train still clung to the air. The whistle's echo faded into the hills, leaving only the hollow rattle of loose boards and the murmurs of townsfolk gathered too long for a spectacle they hadn't expected to see. A woman in white stood there, lace veil trembling against her damp cheeks, bouquet pressed so tightly in her gloved hand that stems snapped beneath her grasp. Her suitcase sat at her feet, battered leather scuffed with travel. But the only thing more worn than the case was her spirit. Her name was Clara Mae Hollister, though no one spoke it aloud. Around here, names became stories before they became people, and she had already been christened something new. The bride left waiting. Children peered from behind their mother's skirts, eyes wide, as though abandonment were a sickness that might leap from her dress and cling to them. The station agent busied himself with papers he had no need to shuffle, cheeks flushed with the second-hand shame of watching another soul's ruin. A group of women whispered by the stove inside, their voices sharp enough to slice through the brittle air. Left at the altar, one said, "Not even wed before he cast her aside." Another added. Clara heard it all. The words wrapped themselves around her chest, each syllable a fresh tightening of rope. She tried to blink away tears, but grief swelled until it spilled, staining her veil, dampening her collar. The sound of her sobbing was soft, but in that quiet station it felt like thunder. Jeb Rawlins had promised her forever, and yet he had not stepped off the train as he vowed he would. He had not come to take her hand, to lead her proudly through town, to claim her as his wife. The train had carried away not just smoke and sound, but her dignity, her hope, the fragile scaffolding of the life she thought she was building. Clara could almost hear the echo of Jeb's laughter in her memory, a careless warmth that now curdled into cruelty. She pressed a hand to her chest as if to hold herself together, but it did little good. Her body trembled in the thin frost. Her heart thudded with humiliation. No one stepped forward. No hand offered her comfort. The station crowd shifted restlessly, as though her shame were contagious, as though kindness cost too much. The air grew colder with each passing breath, and Clara's tears slowed, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. It was then, just as silence threatened to swallow her whole, that a small voice rang out with surprise and clarity. "That's my mama." The words startled the crowd more than a gunshot might have. People turned sharply, eyes seeking the speaker. A boy, no older than 8, stood near the wagon rails, his dark hair mussed by the wind, his boots too big, scuffed from hard play. His name was Samuel Boone, and he gazed at Clara with a certainty that held no doubt, no fear of ridicule. His finger pointed toward her trembling frame, as though the truth had been carved into marrow of his bones. "That's my mama," he repeated, softer this time, but no less sure. Gasps rippled through the townsfolk. Murmurs rose like bees stirred from a hive. Boone's boy gone mad? The widow's child? He's mistook her. Yet Samuel's eyes did not waver. He stepped forward, face earnest, small hand curled into a fist of resolve. Behind him, a tall figure emerged from the crowd, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of man whose presence carried weight without words. Silas Boone, Samuel's father, the rancher who had buried his wife too young and raised his son with the stern patience of the land. His hat shaded his eyes, his coat hung heavy with dust, and his silence seemed louder than the crowd's judgment. He did not correct the boy. He did not laugh at the childish claim. Instead, he tipped his hat toward Clara, the gesture simple but respectful, and in the next breath he lifted her suitcase as though it were meant to be carried by his hand. Whispers flared like sparks in dry grass. Taking in a fallen woman? He'll ruin his name. Mercy or madness? Clara felt the heat of their stares burn hotter than the cold that gnawed her skin. Her lips parted protest, but no words came. Her shame tangled with confusion. With a faint and fragile hope she did not dare believe. Samuel slipped his small hand into hers, warm and firm, his touch brimming with a faith she had never been granted even by those who had sworn to love her. The boy's grip anchored her in a moment that felt both unreal and undeniable. Silas Boone said nothing. He merely nodded toward his wagon, the faintest invitation, and turned as if it were already decided. Clara hesitated. Her pride warred with her need. She knew the whispers would follow her, that this act of mercy would birth more gossip than her abandonment had. Yet the thought of remaining alone at the station, her suitcase staring back at her like a reminder of all she had lost, was unbearable. Her knees weakened, her breath shook, and at last she let Samuel's pull guide her forward. She climbed into the Boone wagon, her dress too fine for its rough boards, her veil catching on a splinter until she tore it free. Silas placed the suitcase beside her, his hand steady, and then he took the reins. The wagon creaked into motion, wheels crunching against the frosted earth. Behind them, the townsfolk watched, whispers trailing in their wake like a pack of wolves reluctant to give chase but unwilling to disperse. The journey stretched in silence. The wind carried with it the scent of pine, the faint smoke of distant chimneys. Clara kept her gaze low, though every so often she stole glances at Silas's hands gripping the reins, scarred, steady, built from a lifetime of labor. His jaw was set unreadable, his profile carved with the patience of stone. Samuel nestled close to her, coat slipping from his shoulders until Clara pulled it up and wrapped it around him. When the wind gusted sharply, Silas shifted in his seat, his broad shoulders breaking the brunt of the cold before it reached her. No words passed between them, yet the silence was not empty. It was a space where grief could rest without judgment. By the time the wagon rattled into Boone land, twilight had already begun to fall. The ranch stood weather-worn, fences leaning, a windmill creaking as it turned slow circles against the pale sky. It was no palace, but it breathed of survival, of work, of roots dug deep into the stubborn soil. Clara climbed down, her hem heavy with dirt, her satin bodice dull by travel. She felt out of place, a fragile ornament in a world carved from grit. Samuel darted ahead, calling her Mama again with innocent delight. His voice echoed against the barn, against the fading sky, as though trying to carve truth into the very air. Clara's throat ached at the sound, yet she could not bring herself to correct him, not when the word felt like balm against her wound. Silas carried her suitcase inside, leading her to a small room at the end of the hall. The door creaked as he opened it, revealing a simple space, a bed draped in a quilt faded by years of washing, a chair by the window, a shelf bare except for a lamp. The room smelled faintly of lavender, though its edges were softened by dust. Clara's heart clenched. She realized this must have been his late wife's room, still waiting in quiet memory. She stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't stay," she whispered, the shame of intrusion pressing down on her. But Silas, steady as ever, set the suitcase by the bed. His voice, low and graveled, broke the silence at last. A roof for the night. No more. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and left her to the quiet. Clara stood there, trembling, her fingers brushing the quilt. Exhaustion weighed on her bones until she sank onto the bed. The softness cradled her in a way she hadn't expected, a gentleness that whispered of care even in absence. Tears slipped once more, but they came slower this time, less violent. She listened to the faint creak of the windmill outside, to the muffled laughter of Samuel somewhere down the hall, to the steady tread of Silas's boots across the wooden floor. The house was not grand, nor was it warm with words, but in its silence, Clara felt something she had not in a long while. She felt seen, if only faintly, if only for a moment. And so the night closed around her, not with the finality of ruin, but with the fragile possibility of beginning. Morning seeped into the Boone ranch slowly, as if even the sun hesitated to disturb the fragile peace that had taken root inside those walls. Clara woke to the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway, the faint clatter of dishes, and the boys' laughter floating like bird song through the timbered house. For a moment she lay still, unsure if the night had been real, or only a fevered dream spun by her weary mind. But the quilt beneath her was firm, the suitcase at her feet tangible, and the soft memory of Samuel's hand tucked in hers lingered too vividly to be imagined. She rose, smoothed her crumpled dress, and braced herself for another day of borrowed existence. The rhythm of the ranch revealed itself quickly. Samuel darted in and out of rooms like a colt too restless for its pen, asking endless questions, tugging at her skirt, presenting her with treasures, a chipped feather, a polished stone, a crooked drawing where she was already labeled Mama. Clara could not correct him, not when the word lit his face with so much joy. Silas watched quietly, eyes unreadable, though now and then she caught him standing in the doorway, a shadow with arms folded, measuring the shape of her presence in his home. He never spoke more than necessity demanded. Waters boiled. Wood stacked. Storms coming. Yet beneath the brevity lay an attentiveness that startled her. He set an extra plate at supper, mended the loose strap on her shoes without remark, left a shawl by the chair when the nights grew colder. Each act was as soft as snow falling. Silent, nearly invisible, but steady enough to change the landscape of her heart. The town, however, did not remain silent. Clara felt their judgment in every errand, every sideways glance at the mercantile. Every whispered word meant to sting. There's the bride who was left. Boone took her in, Lord knows why. What man would stake his name on a woman no one else wanted? She kept her chin low, her basket held firm, but shame pricked her with every comment. Once, outside the blacksmith's, she overheard a group of women laughing cruelly about the lace hem of her dress, tattered from chores. She returned home with burning cheeks, but Samuel's arms around her waist, his proud introduction of her to the ranch dog as my mama, unraveled the sting thread by thread. The boy's faith was stubborn, untouchable, and in its shelter she found a courage she had never known she possessed. Winter thickened, and with it came a rhythm of shared survival. Clara learned to ride a horse under Silas's watch, her hands trembling on the reins, her skirts clumsy against the saddle. He stood close behind, callous palms steadying her wrists, his voice low as he murmured, "Breathe with it, don't fight it." She felt the warmth of his presence, the surety of his patience. Samuel whooped and cheered, racing alongside them on a smaller pony, his laughter echoing across the frozen pasture. The days filled with quiet labors, hauling water, stitching fabric, tending to the fire. At night, the three of them gathered around the table, and though Silas rarely strung more than a handful of words together, the silence grew companionable. Clara found herself filling it with gentle stories, bits of memory, the kind of warmth one offers without realizing it. And sometimes she caught Silas looking at her, not with hunger or pity, but with a solemn kind of regard that both frightened and steadied her. It might have remained that way, slow, unspoken, quietly healing, if not for the day Jeb Rollins returned. The news spread fast, faster than smoke across the plains. He rode into town on a lean horse, drunk on arrogance and liquor, boasting as though nothing had happened. Word reached Clara before she saw him, and dread hollowed her stomach. She tried to remain composed, tried to believe he would not seek her out, but the certainty of his claim still echoed in her bones. He found her outside the mercantile, Samuel at her side, and a basket of flour in her arms. His smile was a sneer wrapped in charm, his eyes sharp with the knowledge of what shame had already done to her. "Clara Mae," he drawled, as if the months had been nothing. "Took you long enough to wait for me." The crowd gathered quick. Gossip-hungry faces pressed in, eager for a spectacle. Clara's pulse thundered as Jeb leaned close, the stench of whiskey heavy on his breath. "You thought you could hide out at Boone's place? You're mine, girl. Always were. Time to come back where you belong." Samuel clutched her skirt, his small voice trembling but certain. "She's my mama. You can't take her." Jeb barked a laugh, cruel and hollow, glancing at the boy with disdain. Boone's got the boy so twisted he can't tell truth from fairy tale. Before Clara could answer, Silas appeared, his shadow falling long across the street. He said nothing, but the air thickened with his presence. The silence between him and Jeb charged like a storm. The crowd held its breath. Jeb smirked, squaring his shoulders, but the bravado cracked when Silas's gaze fixed on him, unflinching, hard as stone. Yet Silas did not speak for Clara. He simply stood, waiting, as though the moment was not his to decide, but hers. The weight of the choice pressed against her chest. Every instinct screamed to shrink, to disappear, to let someone else bear the burden. But Samuel's hand tightened around hers, and she heard in his trembling whisper a plea and a promise. "Mama, don't go." Something broke free inside her then, something she had buried beneath fear and shame. She lifted her chin, breath shaking, and faced Jeb with eyes steadier than her heart. "I am not yours," she said. Her voice cracked, but grew stronger with each word. "I never was." Gasps surged in the crowd. Jeb's face darkened, rage and humiliation twisting his features. He spat at the ground, cursed her name, and swung back onto his horse. With a harsh tug of reins, he galloped away, the echo of hooves scattering like thunder until only dust remained. The crowd buzzed with disbelief, with shock, with the thrill of scandal, but Clara no longer heard them. Her chest heaved, her knees trembled, yet she stood taller than she ever had before. Samuel burst into cheers, his small voice ringing out with triumph. "That's my mama," he shouted. Not to her, not to Silas, but to the entire town, as if daring them to deny it. The word struck like a banner raised, a claim carved into the very air. Silas's gaze met hers across the space, still silent, but in that silence lay a vow deeper than any spoken promise. He had not needed to fight her battle, for she had fought herself. Yet his presence had been the ground she stood upon, steady, unyielding, a shelter that gave her courage to claim her own life. The townsfolk dispersed slowly, their whispers carrying far, but Clara no longer bowed beneath them. She walked back to the wagon with her son's hand in hers. He was not hers by blood, yet the truth of his claim felt more real than any paper or preacher could provide. Silas lifted the basket from her arms, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment, and though no words passed between them, a warmth spread through her chest that rivaled the coldest wind. They rode home in silence, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of beginnings, of something fragile but certain growing the cracks where shame once lived. That night, after Samuel had drifted to sleep, Clara stood at the window of the small room with the faded quilt, watching the stars shimmer above the ranch. The world still whispered, still doubted, but she no longer trembled beneath its gaze. Her reflection in the glass looked different now. Still weary, still worn, but lit with a flame she had not thought she could carry. Behind her, the floor creaked with Silas's steady tread. He paused at the doorway, hat in hand, eyes soft with something unspoken. For a moment they simply regarded each other, the silence stretched thin but rich with possibility. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if to say he had seen her strength and it was enough. And in that quiet house, with the windmill groaning against the winter sky and the boys' even breathing echoing down the hall, Clara understood that she had not been left at the station after all. She had been found. She had been chosen, not as a possession, not as a prize, but as herself. The night closed around her with a peace she had never known, and the promise of something more waiting just beyond the horizon.